Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Dr. Liz Harmon. Dr. Harmon, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm so excited for this conversation. It comes in perfect time in March, Women's Month, and you are the digital curator at the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum. Long title, impressive title. First, before we dive in, tell us exactly what you do.
Yes, so I am part of a small and mighty team to share women's history and create a national museum in Washington, D.C., but really work for the next 10 years until we open our doors to share more women's history online in innovative ways.
So the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum has a digital exhibition that just launched where your team is sharing women's stories that have been previously lost to history. First, can you explain the project just a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So Becoming Visible is our first digital exhibition at the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum. And really, it confronts a central paradox in women's history: the significance and absence of women in American history. So by that I mean, we know women have been making history for centuries, but their stories are still missing from popular narratives of U.S. history. So we need to understand how and why women's stories are missing so that we can increase their impact and visibility today. And that's what we do with this first digital exhibition. So we curated stories from around the Smithsonian, featuring 5 women, to really show how women have been erased, excluded, forgotten, almost lost in our history.
I am curious, you're trying to figure out the how and the why, but how long has this been happening and how recently has it stopped, if at all?
That's a really great question. But part of the reason why, I was so excited to title the exhibition Becoming Visible is this has been a process, and a contested process over centuries, really, across centuries, I should say. Women's historians and historians have been bringing up this issue for a very long time. So folks have known we have records, we have books about women's history, but somehow in our textbooks, our monuments, and our museums, continually, women's stories are left out of these most popular kind of versions of American history that we all internalize over the course of our lives.
This is the museum's first digital exhibition. Can you talk a little bit what went behind the decision to digitize this exhibition?
Yeah, absolutely. We have at least 10 years until we open our doors to our physical museum. So we get to innovate for the next decade and reach more people, online. So this is a really great opportunity for us to experiment with how we create digital experiences and meet folks online where they already are.
Forbes covers entrepreneurs, business people, inventors, and every mover and shaker in between. I would love for you to share some of those stories that fit in that description that you've researched for this exhibition.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really excited to do that. So maybe first, we could talk about the seamstresses of ILC Dover. And Hazel Fellows is one of those women. So there's this fantastic picture of Hazel Fellows at a custom sewing machine that was created while this group of seamstresses was working on creating the Apollo spacesuits. Now, the Project Apollo, undertaken by NASA, was all about putting a person on the moon, right, in the late 50s to the early 70s. Now, a little known element of this story about the creation of these spacesuits, one of the, major inventions of this 20th century, is that there were a group of women seamstresses who played a huge role in creating these spacesuits. And now it might sound really simple, like just a garment when you talk about spacesuits, but really they're machines as well as garments they're personal spacecrafts for people who go to the moon, right, in this period and leave, are actually collecting lunar samples and things like that. So the technology that went into creating these suits was really incredible when you read the history. And it might sound like if you're a seamstress, you're just sewing the suits together and you're not really, right, making a huge contribution. But when you read the history, what you realize is that the women who were doing this work were working with novel fabrics and were collaborating directly with engineers who were learning in that process how to do the engineering work that they needed to do to create the spacesuits, because they understood then the limitations in the fabrication process. And it was only through the expertise of these women that they could do that. And so these stories of we call the Seamstresses of ILC Dover really help us tell this story about the Apollo spacesuits in a new way.
So clearly there is a science behind these suits, and I am curious, how did Hazel Fellows' story specifically get lost to history, and then how was it found by your team?
Yeah, so absolutely. So Hazel Fellows, so she really has come to stand in many ways. The photograph of her working at this sewing machine has become iconic, and it really has kind of come to stand in for a lot of the work of these other seamstresses. We actually, truth be told, don't know much about Hazel Fellows. That record, the written record, kind of census records, people haven't been able to find many details yet. Hopefully someday we do, right? Hopefully someday a family member or someone else can help us find more information. But from other seamstresses who participated in the project, they've done interviews, they're part of texts, they're part of books, so we can learn more about their stories. But the thing is most often there are real limitations to how we can learn about their stories, because they're often voiceless or nameless in records. So for example, one of the videos that features Charlie Duke actually visiting the kind of ILC Dover kind of fabrication space. He's there. It's a video created by NASA. It's jaunty. It's showing him excited to come get his spacesuit in preparation for his mission. They show all of the women working on the shop floor, but they don't name any of them, and they're all voiceless. And I think it's this moment where you realize that the research questions that folks are excited to ask today, and the ways that we're excited to expand our national story, require us to learn more and to ask who those women were and to share their stories more fully. And this is where you get into confronting that limitation of how stories were recorded in the past. And so it's, historians of spaceflight who really dig into these records and try to understand more about who these women were. And so those are the folks that are doing that work of trying to recover these stories. And in featuring it in our exhibition, we really wanted to showcase that work about how those women have been nameless and relatively voiceless in history, and what we can do about it today to kind of help share their story.
I would love for you to give a voice to another seamstress, Elizabeth Keckley, if you could talk about her story a bit for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So Elizabeth Keckley is an incredible figure. She was a shrewd businesswoman, an entrepreneur, a philanthropist. She was born into slavery, though, and she suffered all kinds of abuses. Eventually, she purchased her own freedom and that of her son, and she moved to DC. Part of the way that she purchased the freedom for herself and her son was through her amazing sewing skills. So previously, she had worked to create dresses for elite white women in the cities that she lived in. And she takes those skills to DC as a free woman, and she tries to open a school to teach other young Black women how to sew. Now, at first it isn't successful, so she moves to DC and she ends up creating a dressmaking shop. And she has a lot of success. Eventually, she employs, I believe, over 20 women in her shop, and she eventually makes dresses for Mary Todd Lincoln once she's in the White House for about 4 years. And that, that's where her story really, I think a lot of folks, it kind of intersects with some known elements of American history, in the sense that folks have written a lot about the Lincoln family, and they feature Keckley in that story. Now, I wanted to mention that because Keckley actually wrote an autobiography, which is a big part of her story that's relevant to our exhibition. Keckley's autobiography not only is part of the kind of slave narrative genre, where Keckley recounts her experiences as an enslaved woman, she also, though, recounts her experiences as a business owner and as someone who worked in the Lincoln White House. And in this moment, she's trying to actually, after the death of Abraham Lincoln, Mary Todd Lincoln is heavily indebted. She tries to, there's a kind of scandal that happens in Mary Todd Lincoln's personal story where she tries to sell her dresses in New York, and it's covered and she's denounced for doing so. And Elizabeth Keckley says that in this autobiography that she's actually trying to defend Mary Todd Lincoln and share more about her motivations for doing this. But Elizabeth Keckley is denounced for doing that. As a Black woman in this period, the kind of racial subtext of this is that she is a Black woman sharing information, trying to defend a white woman. And this is against the kind of racial hierarchy that existed for a lot of folks and the expectations of how a Black woman would share her story.
Really interesting story. And I loved how you described Elizabeth Keckley at the top as a shrewd entrepreneur, shrewd business person. I am curious, what's the biggest business learning from your research that you found through her story? Maybe some advice that you could impart on our audience that would still be relevant today.
Yeah, for me, the thing that I take most of all out of Elizabeth Keckley's story is the drive to continue and to live on her own terms. So her first kind of business venture, training young women how to sew, for example, it wasn't successful, but she moved to DC and opened her own shop and had success there. She published her autobiography, and by all accounts, it was disastrous in many ways, but she kept going and she kept working. She ended up teaching more young women how to sew over the course of her lifetime. So I think that not giving up, trying new ventures, but also I think living on your own terms, because Elizabeth Keckley insisted on narrating her story in her own way. And now we have that autobiography to understand more about her life.
Dr. Harmon, I do now want to pivot just a little bit and talk about a great scientist, Isabel Morgan, who helped create the polio vaccine. Can you share a little bit about her story with us?
Yes, absolutely. So Isabel Morgan was a microbiologist, and she played a critical role in developing the polio vaccine, but her story isn't well known. Jonas Salk and other kind of scientists who ended up creating the vaccine that was used get a lot of the attention. But Isabel Morgan really deserves more credit for her contributions because they were really significant in the development of the vaccine, after all. And I can tell you a little bit about those three elements because it's really important to be really, I think in this instance, to be really precise. She really did make significant contributions. So the first thing is that she identified with a team of researchers at Johns Hopkins University kind of three polio subtypes that were important to researchers at the time. She also used an inoculated, killed virus to create immunity in monkeys and was the first person to do that. And then lastly, she also identified that you need multiple rounds of the vaccine for its full effectiveness. And all three of those things were really important as people were developing the vaccine.
When you think about all of these stories that you've uncovered, all of these women in history who were lost, they're now found. Are there any trends that you found, especially when it comes to women in the workforce?
Yeah, that is a wonderful question. I think one of the things, if you're someone who is working in archives, looking for women's stories, in institutional records, in papers that document places of business and work. One of the things that you find is that women's stories are often scattered across different collections. You don't always just type a woman's name into a search and retrieval box and then find their story that's in the collection. One of the challenges is that their records are often scattered, potentially in male relatives or a male colleague's papers. And so it's through looking at those other records that you can find women's stories. And so that I think that is one of the biggest things that you have to know when you're searching for women's history is to look. You need to ask different research questions and look for the history in a different way. This is relatively obvious, but also women's names change. And you need to be aware of that as you try to find their stories, because you can't just use one name. And sometimes you have to search for a husband's or a father's or a brother's name as well.
The Smithsonian American Women's History Museum digital exhibition, Becoming Visible, launched aptly on March 8th, International Women's Day. Where can people find this?
Yeah, absolutely. So come to the Smithsonian American Women's History website. We have an exhibition page, and you can come visit the exhibition and access it from there. And you can learn more also about the women in the exhibition on our website as well.
Dr. Liz Harmon, thank you so much for sharing your insights, your research. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.